The monarchy had survived scandals, storms, betrayals, and bitter family exits, but this was different. This did not begin with a public speech or a palace announcement. It began inside the royal archives, where a sealed bundle of Queen Elizabeth's private letters was opened, and one line changed everything. Archie's name was to be removed from a private royal succession guidance file. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Harry felt the room shrink around him as the archivist read the sentence again. Not loudly, not cruelly, just clearly enough for every word to land like a verdict. The private royal succession guidance file, a confidential palace record used to map future ceremonial recognition and family roles, not a public law of inheritance, had carried Archie's name until the Queen's letters instructed otherwise. That was why this moment mattered. It did not change blood, it changed belonging. It told the family where the child would stand when the crown looked toward its future, and it forced the prince to hear that decision in the voice of the grandmother he had once trusted. The archivist kept both hands on the opened folder, careful, almost reverent, as though the paper itself still carried the monarch's authority. She explained that the bundle had been found during a formal archive review, a routine process where old royal papers are checked, catalogued, and preserved. Senior aides had expected dates, notes, and personal reflections. They had not expected a directive sharp enough to shake the Sussex story at its roots. Harry's jaw tightened. He was no longer listening as a prince. He was listening as a father, and the name on the page was not a symbol to him. It was his son. Meghan was not in the room, but her absence pressed against every silence. Harry knew how the news would sound when he carried it home. Not like procedure, not like neat palace language, like rejection, like another door closing after years of exile, argument, and distance. The Queen had not written with anger, but the phrasing felt deliberate, cold, and final. She spoke of royal distance, inherited responsibility, and the danger of expectation without duty. Each line carried the weight of a woman who had watched the monarchy survive by drawing hard borders before emotion could blur them. William heard before the wider family, and his quiet reaction troubled Harry almost as much as the letter itself. The prince did not look surprised. He looked burdened. That mattered because William's silence suggested the Queen's fear had not been sudden. It had lived inside the palace long before the seal was broken. Harry turned back to the archivist and asked who had authorized the removal. No one answered at first. Then she placed a second envelope on the table. The name written across it made the room fall silent. But the first letter was only the beginning, because the next name on the envelope would pull every member of the family into the storm. Every royal crisis has names on paper, but every royal wound has faces behind it. Harry saw Archie's future. William saw the crown's survival. Charles saw his mother's handwriting returning from the grave. And somewhere between duty and blood, the family was forced to confront the question Elizabeth had left behind. Who truly belongs to the monarchy when loyalty and lineage no longer point in the same direction? Harry did not hear the letter as a palace record. He heard it as a father. Every sentence seemed to move past him and reach directly toward Archie, turning a child's name into a question of duty, distance, and royal place. That was why the wound cut so deeply. The removal was not only about a private file or a ceremonial future. It felt to him like a judgment on his marriage, his choices, his exile, and the family he had built beyond the palace gates. The prince had fought for freedom, but now freedom seemed to come with a price written in his grandmother's hand. William carried a different pain, and that made the divide even sharper. The prince was not looking at Archie as a rival or a threat. He was looking at the crown as something fragile, something Elizabeth had protected with discipline when love alone could not hold it together. To him, the Queen's letters were not an attack, they were a warning. A child raised outside royal duty could not be placed inside royal expectation without creating confusion later. The future king understood the cruelty of that truth, but he also understood why the monarch had written it down before anyone else dared to say it aloud. Charles faced the letter in a silence that said more than any speech could. He read the copy alone, lowered his glasses, and set them beside the paper with a hand that seemed suddenly heavy. The king was trapped between two roles that could not comfort each other. As a father, he knew Harry would see betrayal. As sovereign, he knew Elizabeth's handwriting carried a force no courtier could dismiss. He had inherited the throne, but with it came the grief of enforcing a decision that touched his own grandson. Harry's anger hardened because Archie had not chosen the break. Adults had argued. Adults had left. Adults had spoken, accused, defended, and retreated. Yet the child's name now sat at the center of the consequence. William believed the Queen was shielding Archie from a life half-promised and never fully given, but Harry could not accept protection that felt like exclusion. Then the Archivists delivered the blow that changed the temperature of the room. There were multiple letters, not one. Elizabeth had returned to the subject over several years, each note more urgent than the last. And hidden in the margin of one page was a reference to a private conversation with Charles, suggesting the king may have been warned before the archive ever opened. Harry demanded to see every letter. The palace hesitated. And in that hesitation, everyone understood one document pointed backward to the moment that had triggered the Queen's final decision. And to understand why Elizabeth wrote those words, the story must return to the single private moment that made her believe the future had already changed. The decision did not appear from nowhere. It was born in one quiet Windsor gathering that looked harmless from the outside and unforgettable to those inside. A tea, a short exchange, a child's name spoken softly, and a monarch watching the room with the instincts of a woman who had spent 70 years reading what others tried to hide. Elizabeth had not raised the subject by accident. The family had gathered after a memorial service, when grief usually softened old arguments and made even divided relatives speak with care. Yet the Queen chose that moment because sorrow has a way of stripping away performance. She asked Harry whether Archie would be raised with any active royal obligation or ceremonial duty. Ceremonial duty meant the public roles, appearances, and symbolic responsibilities that connect a royal child to the institution, even before adulthood. The question sounded gentle, but everyone close enough to understand palace language knew it carried weight. Harry answered like a man guarding a future he believed had already been threatened. He said Archie deserved freedom before tradition. He wanted his son to grow without the constant pressure of titles, expectations, and palace judgment. To Harry, the answer was loving. It was protection. It was the kind of fatherhood he wished someone had offered him before duty consumed so much of his own childhood. But Elizabeth heard something deeper. She heard not a pause in royal life, but a break from it. She understood that the Sussex path had moved beyond distance and into a separate destiny. The Queen remained calm. That was what made the moment so powerful. She did not challenge Harry. She did not correct him. She simply listened, holding the silence with the discipline of a monarch who knew that one sentence could reveal an entire future. Later, an aide would recall in a documented palace account that her hand rested against the arm of her chair, still and firm, as though his answer had confirmed something painful she had feared for years. Harry left believing he had defended Archie's independence. Elizabeth stayed behind with Charles, and the room changed. Charles listened, as his mother asked the question no one wanted to say aloud. Should a child raised away from royal duty ever be listed in future ceremonial planning? The king, then still waiting for the throne, understood the danger. If Archie was kept inside the royal map, expectation would follow him. If he was removed, pain would follow Harry. Elizabeth chose the wound she believed would cause less damage later. That evening, she began drafting the first letter. Her words were careful, but devastating. Protection from expectation, and clarity before confusion. William's name appeared in a margin note, hinting that she wanted the future king to understand the emotional cost of protecting the crown. The T explained the letters, but it did not explain why the archive released them now. Once Harry understood that one private conversation had shaped Archie's fate, grief hardened into fury. and fury demanded a face-to-face answer. The confrontation was not loud at first. That made it worse. Harry entered the room carrying the rage of a father, while William stood waiting with the restraint of a future king. No aides, no palace buffer, no softening language. Just two brothers, one letter, and a silence so heavy it seemed to carry every unresolved wound between them. Harry did not sit immediately. He held the copy of Elizabeth's letter as if it were evidence in a trial no one had agreed to hold. The prince had learned that William's name appeared in the margin, and that detail had changed everything. It no longer felt like a decision discovered by chance. It felt guided. It felt known. And because the future king had been named, Harry demanded the answer plainly. Had his brother supported Archie's removal from the private file? William looked at the paper before he looked at Harry. The private file mattered because it shaped ceremonial recognition, the quiet palace planning that decides who is treated as part of the working royal future, even when no public law is being rewritten. The prince explained that Elizabeth had not written those letters to punish a child. She had written them to define a hard truth. Royal status could not survive without royal duty. To William, the Queen was not erasing Archie. She was preventing a future where the boy would be trapped between a name he carried and a role he had never been raised to live. Harry pushed the letter across the table. The movement was small, but the meaning was brutal. He said his son's name had been turned into a palace decision, as if Archie were a problem to be solved rather than a child to be protected. William kept his voice low, but the restraint cost him. He knew anger would only deepen the wound. He also knew silence would look like guilt. So he chose the hardest path and told Harry the Queen had carried this burden alone for years. Harry recoiled. Those words did not comfort him. They sounded like acceptance. They sounded like William had already made peace with a decision that shattered him. The prince said Elizabeth feared ambiguity more than exile. Ambiguity, he explained, meant leaving Archie close enough to the crown to attract expectation, but too far from duty to understand its demands. That was the trap she feared most: privilege without purpose, attention without preparation, bloodline without belonging. William's pain finally surfaced when he admitted the Queen had known the choice would wound the family. Harry heard that pain, but he could not forgive it. Then his eyes moved to a second file on the desk, marked for Charles. In that instant, the truth became colder. The letter had opened the wound, but the king would have to make the removal official inside palace records. Harry left without shaking William's hand. The silence after the door closed was worse than the argument. The brothers had spoken as sons and rivals, but now the king had to act as sovereign, and the cost of that act would be devastating. Power inside a monarchy rarely announces itself with thunder. Sometimes it appears as a pen placed beside a document, waiting for one trembling hand. Charles had spent his life preparing for crowns, councils, and constitutional duty, but nothing prepared him for the moment his mother's private instruction forced him to choose between the aching heart of a father and the cold machinery of kingship. Charles understood that this was no longer only about an archived letter. The decision now rested with him, and that made the burden almost unbearable. Palace ceremonial records, private internal files used to organize future royal roles, appearances, and symbolic family recognition, had to reflect whether Elizabeth's instruction would be honored or quietly left untouched. The king knew why the record mattered. It shaped how the family would be treated inside the institution, even when the public saw only smiles, titles, and carefully worded statements. If Archie's name remained, confusion would survive. If it disappeared, Harry would feel betrayed again. The Archivists did not offer opinion. They offered proof. The chain of custody, the verified record showing where a document came from, who preserved it, and how it remained protected, confirmed that the letters came directly from Elizabeth's private papers. The Queen had not left vague wishes. She had left preserved instruction. Charles listened as the archivists explained how the bundle had been sealed, logged, and held under direct order. Each detail tightened the room around him, because every safeguard made the decision harder to dismiss. His mother had not spoken carelessly. She had prepared this moment. Charles sat alone with the file after the meeting, and for several seconds, the crown felt heavier than any coronation could ever make it. He touched the edge of the paper before signing, as if one more pause might reveal a gentler path. But there was no gentle path. As a father, he knew Harry would hear cruelty. As king, he knew Elizabeth's words carried a command deeper than comfort. The monarch had spent his life waiting to inherit authority, yet now that authority demanded he wound his own son. Camilla watched him afterward and saw the cost written across his silence. The queen consort did not interrupt. She understood that Charles had won the power to decide, but lost the peace that should have come with it. He could not explain the choice without reopening every Sussex wound, every public accusation, every private disappointment, every family fracture that still refused to heal. The official action did not alter legal birthright. That truth mattered. Archie's bloodline was untouched, but the removal from the private ceremonial framework carried a different kind of force, because it signaled that affection would not be allowed to create institutional confusion. A senior courtier later confirmed through a documented palace account that Elizabeth had separated love from duty with painful care, writing that love for a child could not become uncertainty for the crown. Charles signed. The change was complete, and when Harry was told, his silence did not feel like surrender. It felt like the moment before a storm. With one signature, the private letter became public consequence, and Harry's stunned silence began to turn into something far more dangerous. The first hours after the decision felt like a palace holding its breath. Doors closed softly. Phones rang behind guarded walls. Names were spoken carefully, and far from the archive room, Harry sat with the final message in his hand, reading the words again, as if repetition might change them, as if a father's disbelief could force history to step backward. Harry did not react at once. That silence frightened the people around him more than anger would have. The confirmation was short, polished, and almost painfully controlled, but every neat sentence carried the same brutal meaning. Archie's name had been removed from the private ceremonial framework. That framework mattered because it shaped how the palace prepared future roles, appearances, and symbolic recognition within the royal family. It was not public law. It was not a change to bloodline. But inside the monarchy, quiet records often speak louder than public declarations. And the prince understood that this file would define how his son was seen behind closed doors. The palace moved quickly, because hesitation could turn a private wound into a public war. Senior staff prepared an internal briefing and were instructed to call the removal a ceremonial clarification. The phrase sounded clean. It sounded harmless. But everyone who repeated it knew the truth beneath it. Clarification meant Archie was no longer being quietly held inside the royal future. Clarification meant Elizabeth's letters had moved from memory into action. Clarification meant Harry would have to explain one day why his son's name had been crossed out of a world he had been born close to, but never fully welcomed into. Harry lowered the paper slowly. He was not stunned by procedure. He had lived long enough inside the palace to know how soft language could hide hard decisions. What broke through him was the finality. His son's name was no longer a discussion, no longer a concern, no longer a question for another day. It was gone from the record, and the space it left behind felt louder than the words still printed on the page. Meghan received the news with controlled sadness, the kind that does not need raised voices to reveal pain. She asked Harry whether anyone had spoken for Archie before the decision was sealed. That question cut through him, because he did not have an answer that would comfort her. The Duchess understood what palace language could do. She knew how a decision dressed as tradition could still feel deeply personal. Harry looked at the message again, and for the first time, the wound turned outward. Then the palace discovered the story had already started to escape. A summary of Elizabeth's letters had reached trusted media contacts, and that meant the decision could no longer remain contained within private rooms and careful briefings. William urged restraint, warning that anger would only deepen the damage. Charles feared something worse, that any public statement would make the monarchy look merciless, and the family look broken beyond repair. Then Harry received a private message from Charles, requesting one final conversation. The wording was brief, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. This would not be about records anymore. This would be about a father facing the son he had wounded by obeying his own mother. The palace could manage records and statements, but it could not manage the next conversation between a wounded son and a haunted father. There were no officials in the room this time, no archivists, no advisors, no royal language polished for public consumption. Charles and Harry faced each other not as king and prince, but as father and son, standing in the wreckage of choices neither could fully undo. For the first time, the argument was not about titles. It was about pain. Charles had chosen this meeting because the distance had become too dangerous to hide behind. The archive decision had already deepened the family fracture, but he knew a formal message would only make the wound colder. Harry arrived guarded, angry, and unwilling to offer the comfort of politeness. Yet the absence of aides changed the air between them. Without procedure, neither man could escape into official phrases. Without witnesses, every word became heavier, because it belonged only to them. Harry waited for defense. He expected Charles to speak like the monarch, to explain the file, the letters, the duty, the old machinery of the crown. Instead, the king admitted the decision hurt him too. The words did not heal anything, but they stopped Harry for one sharp second. He had walked in ready to fight authority. He had not prepared himself to face grief. Charles was not asking for pity. He was showing the cost of obedience, and that made the betrayal harder to hold in one simple shape. Harry's voice tightened when he said Archie would one day ask why his name had been removed. That question carried more than anger. It carried a father's fear of having to explain a wound he never wanted his child to inherit. Charles answered carefully, but not coldly. Elizabeth had believed clarity would wound less than false expectation. False expectation meant allowing a child to grow near the language of royal belonging while never being prepared for the burden behind it. To the Queen, that would not have been kindness. It would have been a slow confusion dressed as affection. Charles then revealed the line from Elizabeth's final letter that changed the meaning of everything. She had written that the family must not confuse distance with rejection. The sentence did not erase the pain, but it shifted the ground beneath it. The Queen had not wanted Archie punished for Harry's choices. She had wanted him protected from a half-life inside a system that demands everything from those it claims. Harry did not forgive the decision. Forgiveness would have been too easy, too clean, too false. But he stopped arguing long enough to understand that the monarch's motive had been more complex than punishment. It was still a wound. It was still a removal. Yet it was not simple cruelty. When Harry left, he carried the final letter copy with him. Charles remained behind, with the silence of a father who had spoken, but not been absolved. The palace prepared for the public reaction, knowing the world would judge what the family could barely survive. The private pain had reached its limit, and once the story broke outside palace walls, the nation began judging what the family could not explain. By dawn, the story no longer belonged to the palace. It belonged to breakfast tables, phone screens, radio studios, and crowds gathering beneath iron gates. Archie's name appeared beside Elizabeth's letters, in headlines sharp enough to cut through years of royal silence. What had been sealed in an archive was now being weighed by the public, and the verdict was anything but simple. Harry watched the coverage without speaking. That silence carried its own kind of grief. Only hours earlier, Archie's name had been part of a private family wound, something handled through letters, records, and tense conversations behind closed doors. Now it had become a national argument. The archive revelation had reached full public coverage, forcing the palace to acknowledge that Elizabeth's letters had reshaped Archie's ceremonial future. Ceremonial future meant the planned royal roles, appearances, and symbolic recognition a family member might receive inside the monarchy's private system. It did not change who Archie was by blood, but it changed how the institution would prepare for him. That was why the story hit so hard. It touched identity, duty, and belonging all at once. William saw the headlines and tightened his jaw. The prince understood the danger immediately. If he defended Elizabeth's logic, he would seem cold to everyone who saw only a child's name removed. If he stayed silent, he would appear to accept a wound without explanation. Commentators split sharply. Some called the decision a harsh exclusion, proof that the monarchy could still turn family pain into official distance. Others framed it as the Queen's final act of constitutional clarity, a painful line drawn before confusion could become crisis. Constitutional clarity meant making the Crown's rules and expectations unmistakable, so public affection would not be mistaken for royal obligation. Harry kept listening as Archie's name moved from studio to studio. The pain was no longer private enough to protect. Every debate seemed to take something intimate and make it colder. William felt the same pressure from the other side, because he knew the Crown had survived by making choices that looked heartless before history called them necessary. The brothers were wounded by the same headline in opposite ways. Then one public moment came to define the day. A crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace as a morning newspaper front page spread across newsstands with the words, "The Queen's Letters and Archie's Future," beside a stark image of sealed royal stationery. The phrase traveled fast because it captured the shock in a way palace language never could. A broadcaster later called it, "the moment love and duty finally collided." And suddenly, the nation had its frame. Sympathy for Harry, understanding for Elizabeth, and unease about what the Crown demands from those born near it. Charles knew the palace could not let the debate write the ending alone. The king shaped one final statement himself, choosing each word with the care of a father and the burden of a sovereign. Its meaning would decide whether the crisis looked like punishment, protection, or something painfully between the two. The nation had spoken in confusion, anger, and sympathy. But the final meaning of the letters would come from the family they wounded most. In the end, the letters did not destroy the monarchy, and they did not heal the family. They did something more painful. They forced everyone to see the truth Elizabeth had carried quietly. Royal blood could open a door, but only duty could keep it open. For Harry, the discovery was a wound. For Archie, it became a boundary. For the Crown, it became a verdict. Charles knew the final palace statement would not comfort everyone. It could not. The words had been shaped with care, but care could not soften the truth beneath them. Elizabeth's letters had been accepted as a guiding expression of her private wishes regarding ceremonial family planning. That phrase mattered, because ceremonial family planning meant the quiet internal process by which the palace decides future appearances, symbolic roles, and places of recognition around the monarchy. It did not rewrite public law. It did not deny blood, but it marked where duty ended and distance began. Harry stood with the letter one last time, and he was no longer stunned in the same way. The first shock had burned away, leaving something heavier behind. He understood now that anger could not reverse what the Queen had written. He could reject the meaning. He could resent the decision. He could carry the hurt for years, but he could not make the page forget its own words. Archie's legal identity had not been debated, and that distinction mattered. But his place inside a private royal duty framework had been removed according to Elizabeth's recorded instruction. To Harry, the difference between law and belonging felt painfully thin. Charles carried the deepest burden because he had honored his mother while wounding his son. The king had followed the monarch who came before him, but the father inside him knew the cost would not disappear when the file closed. Every careful sentence in the statement protected the Crown, yet every sentence also risked hardening the distance with Harry. That was the cruel power of royal duty. It could preserve an institution while leaving a family quieter, colder, and harder to reach. William understood that truth better than anyone wanted to admit. The prince knew the monarchy had not survived because its choices were easy. It had survived because Elizabeth chose clarity, even when clarity hurt people she loved. Archie had not been erased from family blood. He had been removed from a royal expectation the Queen believed would only bring confusion and conflict. That was the final emotional truth, and it landed with devastating force. Elizabeth's letters turned a family dispute into a monarchy-defining lesson. Love may remain private, but the crown survives only when duty is made unmistakably clear. There was no victory in the room when the file closed. Only the heavy acceptance that Elizabeth's final words had protected the crown by breaking the hearts around it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.